Okay, so last week we finished chapter 7 in Matthew. Probably by the time we get done with the book of Matthew, I'm not sure what year it's going to be. The kids might have graduated from college. We don't know. So we're starting chapter 8. All right, and we're gonna do in chapter 8 verses 1 to 13. It's not that much, but I have a lot of stuff that I wrote on it, so I'm going to go ahead and read it first. Jesus heals a man with leprosy. All right, so this is kind of like the end of the Sermon on the Mount. All right, the Sermon on the Mountain. This is kind of the end of it. So, when Jesus came down from the mountainside, large crowds followed him. A man with leprosy came and knelt before him and said, "Lord, if you are willing, can you make me clean?" Jesus reached out his hand and touched the man. "I am willing," he said. "Be clean." Immediately he was cleansed of his leprosy. Then Jesus said to him, "See that you don't tell anyone, but go, show yourself to the priest, and offer the gift Moses commanded as a testimony." Now this little next snippet here is really pretty crazy. The faith of the centurion. When Jesus had entered Capernaum, a centurion came to him, asking for help. "Lord," he said, "my servant lies at home, paralyzed, suffering terribly." Jesus said to him, "Shall I heal him, or shall I come and heal him?" ? The centurion replied, "Lord, I do not deserve to have you come under my roof, but just say the word, and my servant will be healed. For I myself am a man under authority, with soldiers under me. I tell this one, go, and he goes, and that one, come, and he comes. I say to my servant, do this, and he does it." When Jesus heard this, he was amazed, and said to those following him, "Truly I tell you, I have not found anyone in Israel with such great faith. I say to you that many will come from the east and the west, and will take their places at the feast of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. But the subjects of the kingdom will be thrown out into the darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth." Then Jesus said to the centurion, "Go, let it be done just as you believed it would." And his servant was healed at that very hour. Whew, man. There's a ton going on here. A ton. All right. Here we see Jesus coming down off the mountainside. All right. The Sermon on the Mountain is done. He's coming down. Jesus has just given the Jews and the people of Israel a new revelation, a new way to interpret the law, a heart tune-up, and just fulfilled a ton of prophecy. Jesus just fulfilled a ton of prophecy the day before. Okay, like a ton of prophecy, all led up to him giving the Sermon on the Mount and opening up the people's hearts and bringing in this era of grace. Okay? Just fulfilled a ton of prophecy in a very short time. And how he's going to keep on doing the same thing, starting with, this is the first physical healing that Jesus has done. All right? When he healed the man with leprosy. All right? Something I think is notable here. Leprosy was thought, in these times, leprosy was thought to be only from God. So if you had leprosy, you were cursed by God with leprosy. That's what was thought. And the only way for you to be healed from leprosy was for God to take it away from you. All right? The same today as it was then, leprosy is almost untreatable still today. If leprosy isn't caught in the most early stages of leprosy, even today, it can't be healed or treated. It can't even be treated if it's not caught early enough. If it's caught early enough, it can be treated, and in some cases healed. Okay? So leprosy is a pretty big thing. And back then, the Jews and all, anyone that got his leprosy thought that it was a punishment from God and only God could take it away. Okay? It was not treatable or curable even in the day. The only people given the task of attempting to help people with leprosy were the Lord's ministers and priests. As they prayed, they would pray to God about it. So there was no doctors that even attempted to help people with leprosy. Because you could catch it. It was very easily spreadable. That's why people with leprosy, back in these times, there was whole communities of people with leprosy. There was nobody in the community that didn't have leprosy. Okay? That's what in the Old Testament there was the valley of the lepers. It was a whole valley where it was nothing but people with leprosy. Because if you got leprosy, that's where you went. Yeah. Yeah, when people with leprosy would come near a normal town, they would have to shout out. If they saw somebody coming, they would have to say, unclean, unclean. So you would know not to go near to them because you would catch it. All right? So the only people that were ever given the task of trying to heal or cure or treat leprosy were the priests and ministers of God. Not the God of Egypt, not the God of Rome, the God of heaven, the one true real God. He was his ministers and his people were the only ones. So this is pretty big. That the first physical healing that Jesus did was a leper. How did the leper know to come to Jesus? Right? He came and was like, Lord. He called him Lord. Heal me if you're willing. That's pretty heavy. This is the one reason why Jesus told the man. This is one of the reasons why Jesus told that man, go and show the priests that you've been healed. Don't show anybody else, but go and show the priests. Who are the priests, right? They weren't Gentiles. The Jews called the Gentiles dogs. Everybody that wasn't a Jew was a Gentile. In the Jew's mind, there was a Jew and a Gentile. That's it. The Gentiles were dogs. That's what they considered. Everyone that wasn't a Gentile or wasn't a Jew was a Gentile dog. So Jesus healed this man and told him, don't show anybody, but go to the priests, because only the priests were only Jews. Okay? They were the big wigs, the big heads, the big timers. So he said, go and show the priests that you're healed, and do according to the law, give the appropriate sacrifice or offering at the altar. Okay? Because in the priest's eyes, only God could heal leprosy. Only God. I'm not 100% sure, but I don't think there were any instances in history that leprosy all of a sudden cured itself. I mean, I didn't really look into it, but it's not spoken of anywhere that leprosy, just like, this person miraculously, ate a mushroom and now they're cured of leprosy. All right? So this is pretty big. Jesus cured this man of leprosy, and he said, go to the priest and show him. All right? According to the law of Moses concerning leprosy. There was law of Moses concerning leprosy, and when the leper was healed, they had to go and give gifts and offerings at the altar. We have to see that all this is taking place here. First, Jesus healed a man of leprosy. Next, he told the man to go show the priests, then for him to make the offering about the healing. God uses Jesus not only to heal a man, but also to show the priests what his son Jesus has and can do for the people of this earth, and how he does it all according my notes to Scripture, law, and prophecy. So God is using Jesus not only to heal this man of leprosy, but also this is sending a message, this man, to the priests, to the important guys that wear the big funny hats and all the jewelry and everything. He's using to heal this man
and to show the priests that the God of heaven is now here on earth, and he's doing healings on earth. All right? Now we're going to go to verses 5 to 9. The faith of the centurion. This one is heavy duty. All right? This is a pretty amazing piece of scripture. First off, what is a centurion? Does anybody know? You know what a centurion is? Is it like a guy that wears a clown suit and jumps around?
King of the guards, isn't it?
Yeah, a centurion. First off, a centurion is a Roman. Only a Roman. Romans had centurions. Second off, a centurion is a Gentile. Because if you're a Roman, well, there were Roman citizens that were Jews. But if you're a Roman, born Roman, you're a Gentile. So, in the eyes of a Jew, what is a Gentile? A dog. He's a Roman dog, but he's also a commander of the Roman army. In most cases, a centurion was an officer. An officer was way above any of the normal guys. You know, when I was in the army, when you see an officer, when I was an enlisted man, when I'm outside, when I'm outdoors, and I see an officer, I have to stop and salute that officer. In the army, that's what you do. When you're doing anything and you see, unless you're like in the midst of battle, okay, when you see an officer, you stop and you salute that officer because you are to give that officer great respect in every manner. Because that officer, his job is so important in the military. An officer's job, an officer has men under him, lots of men under him. He is in command over many men. Okay, and that's what a Roman centurion is. But here we see a Roman centurion who, in the eyes of the Jews, is a dog, you know, and Romans typically hated Jews. They thought they were some crazy nutbag cult, you know, because remember, in Rome, they had hundreds of gods in Rome. They didn't believe in one God. All right? Commander of the Roman army, he was a very absolute, this Roman centurion was the very absolute last person anyone in Jerusalem would have thought the Christ would do a miracle for or would have faith at all. This is the last person in Jerusalem that the Jews would have thought that God or Jesus would do a miracle for and have faith. Like, why would they think that this Roman commander would have faith in their God? Why would they think that their God would do a miracle for this man? You know what I mean? And here, this Roman centurion is showing great faith. Great faith. So much so that Jesus said he is amazed. Jesus is amazed. We're going to get to that. This is crazy stuff. His faith was amazing. How did this Roman have such piety and humility and faith? When he spoke to Jesus, now this is something to note. When this Roman centurion, this commander of Roman armies, and this guy had a whole, you know, in Jerusalem, there was all these Romans that were there. They called garrison. Okay, it was a garrison. He had a garrison under him. A garrison's like a troop or a whole, you know,
Army.
yeah, like I was a company. He had a whole company under him. You know, he had tons of people under him. This guy was the big boss. He was a centurion. So he came to Jesus. The centurion came to Jesus, and what did he say? What was the first thing out of his mouth? He called Jesus Lord. Okay? That's very important. That's one little four-letter word that's so important here. When he came and saw Jesus, the first thing out of his mouth was Lord. When he addressed Jesus, he didn't say, hey, buddy. He didn't say, hey, man. He said, Lord. That's showing respect to Jesus. This guy was a Roman commander, and he's calling this man who looks like nobody from Nowhereville Lord. That's heavy duty.
That's bad in the Roman world too, right?
It could be, yeah.
Yeah, he could lose his head for that.
Okay. He referred to Jesus as Lord when he asked of Jesus. He had such humility that he said that he doesn't deserve for Jesus to come under his roof. If we can read in verses 5 to 9, he said, Lord, heal my servant. And Jesus said, shall I come? Question mark. Right? And then he said, no, I don't even deserve for you to come under my roof. Where did this Roman soldier get this faith and humility from? And he goes on to say, Lord, just say it. And I know it will be done. Just say it. And then he expounds on his belief. He says, I am a man that has people under me, and I say to them, go and do, and they do. And I say to them, come and look, and they do. They do what I say. I'm a commander. He's kind of saying like, Lord, I have people under me that do what I tell them, because I'm in charge, just like you. But you are in more charge than I am. You are in such charge that you can tell this disease, this infirmity. Now this man, the centurion's servant who was sick, he wasn't just sick, he didn't have a fever. He had palsy. He was having seizures. And all, what does it say here? No. He said, my servant lies home, paralyzed, suffering terribly. The commentary refers to what the servant had as palsy. So we might call that cerebral palsy. And that's what, like a nerve, something wrong with your nerves. It's bad. It's really bad. To this day, it's something that's very difficult to treat and heal. Okay? So, man, right here we see the first two healings that Jesus did were, the first one's leprosy. To this day, it can barely be treated or cured. The second one is palsy. To this day, it can barely be treated or cured. And Jesus does it in such miraculous ways. He comes down off the Sermon on the Mount, just fulfilling all this prophecy, changing all this stuff, just pouring out grace, showing us that the grace of God is finally coming into this world, that it's time for the grace that was prophesied about, the promise. It's time for the promise. The promise is being poured out. Then he comes down off the mountain, and the first two things he does is heal these men that's just out of sight. And he uses this Roman centurion. You know what I mean? He couldn't have picked a better candidate to display his grace and mercy in. This Roman centurion. You know what I mean? And this Roman centurion has faith that's miraculous. It's so miraculous that Jesus is amazed by it. Okay? He says that Jesus, he doesn't even want, he doesn't deserve for Jesus to come under his roof. And his level of faith was such that Jesus says in verse 10 that he was amazed. It says that Jesus was amazed in verse 10. This is something we must ponder. How did this Roman know about God? How did this Roman know about Jesus? How did this Roman know to come and find Jesus at this point in time? How did this Roman have such faith that he came to Jesus and said, do this. You don't even have to come. Just say, I know you have the authority to do it. You're the same as me, but better. I have the authority to say to my men, go and do what they do, or they die. You have the authority to say to this infirmity, but my servant has, to leave, and it will. That is major, major faith. Okay? How did he have faith enough to seek out Jesus with tremendous humility and ask Jesus to merely say the word, and his servant would be healed? We have to realize that a Roman centurion has just referred to a Nazarene Jew as Lord. He calls him Lord. This act screams of Jesus' sovereignty and how God put into any man's heart, how God can put into a man's heart whatever he pleases. And at this specific time chose to use a Roman, a Gentile, to show the power and righteousness of Jesus. As we should know that Jews looked at all Gentiles as dogs, we must look deeper into the entire act of this Roman centurion. He came to Jesus for his servant. This Roman centurion came to Jesus on behalf of his servant. What does that say about the centurion? That he cares for his servant, right? This Roman centurion cared for his servant. This in itself is very odd, as many Romans were noted to be very merciless people. Nor, especially a centurion, especially a commander, they typically wouldn't care about their servant. They would say, oh, my servant's sick, kick him out, give me a new servant. You know what I mean? Normally, if they had a sick or lame servant, that servant would be replaced. Note here that what Christ says rings true, that anyone who seeks him will find him and keep finding more of him. So this Roman centurion must have been seeking Christ. And when Christ, turned on the light switch, whatever, however you want to think about it, when this Roman centurion found out who Jesus Christ was, he had to just keep seeking him and keep finding more of him. And it's the same stands true for us. When we seek God, we're going to find God. And we're going to keep finding more of God as we keep seeking God. All right? Now we're going to move on to verses 10 to 13. All right? Jesus was amazed at this act. Not that Jesus didn't know this man's faith. For Jesus is the one that put the faith in him. But Jesus admired it. He admired this man's faith because it was great and excellent, rare and uncommon. And Christ spoke of it as wonderful. He did this to teach us to admire it. This is true grace from God in action. This is grace in action, Addie. The wonders of grace should affect us more than any wonder. So, the wonders of grace. Do we see the grace that's taking place here? Jesus, a Nazarene Jew, had a Roman commander come to him, refer to him as Lord, ask him to heal his servant, and Jesus did it with words spoken. This is amazing grace. How sweet the sound. Right? Jesus is using this as an example to show us his grace and how wonderful it is, and that we should, when we look at this grace, we need to have wonder. Okay, when we look at nature, we have wonder. When you look at nature and how magnificent it is, Addie, when you look at birds and cats and trees and the sun coming up and rising every morning and the seasons of change and how grass grows and little baby animals get born every day, it's wonderful. It's amazing, right? It's miraculous. How can this be? How can it be that you plant this little nothing seed in the ground and a great magnificent tree can come out of it? That's wonderful. It's amazing. But the grace of Christ, the grace that Christ brings is more wonderful and more amazing. And then he's using this as an example to show us how amazing his grace is and how wonderful it is and how bigger than this universe and this earth and all this stuff it is. This is a mighty example. We need to look at all the different angles of this little thing, this Roman centurion coming, and what he's doing and what he said and what took place here. The faith that he has. Who has faith like that? Who has that kind of faith? Christians have been in church their whole life. You know? Sometimes we don't have that same faith. We need to look at this Roman centurion and wonder, where did this faith come from? All right? Grace is our greatest gift. Jesus goes on to say how many people will come from the east and the west to take their place at the feast of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. All right? He uses this as an example to tell and show the Jews and all the people around that guess what, guys? All the stuff that was talked about in Malachi, in the Old Testament, where he's going to put his people on the four corners of the earth, and from the four winds, he's going to draw his people to him. It's time. It's time for that. The Jews were the chosen people of God. But now God is showing all his chosen people. And they're coming from the Gentiles. And they're coming from all over the earth. This Roman centurion is one of the first showings of where God can say, anyone can be my people. Any people can be my people. It's not just the Jews. And he's using this example right here. Right? He says, I say to you that many will come from the east and the west. He's talking about the Gentiles, the people that aren't Jews, and will take their place at the feast of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. So the Gentiles are going to come, and it's their time. It's their time to take their place in the feast of the kingdom. All right? Next to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Those are the greats. Those are the big heads of the Old Testament. Those are the ones that God chose and used for very specific events. Okay? And he says in verse 12, but the subject of the kingdom, the subjects, this is the Jews he's talking about. The subjects of the kingdom will be thrown out into the darkness. All the Jews that thought they were so great and so good and the only people chosen of God, they're about to be booted to the curb. They're about to be kicked out. I'm sorry to say it, but the Jews in Jerusalem that practice Judaism, they're not going to heaven. Flat out. Unless they profess faith in Christ, which they don't, they're not going to make it. It says right here, but the servants of the kingdom. The Jews still think today that they're the servants of the kingdom. It's black and white. They will be thrown out into the darkness where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. The Jews in Jerusalem today that go to the Wailing Wall and wail and read this Old Testament stuff, the ones that are still waiting on Christ to come, they still think that the Christ is coming. He has came, and they didn't believe him. What did they do? They killed him, right? Those people are going to be thrown out into the darkness where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. He's talking about the Gentiles and how in verse 12, the subject of the kingdom, the Jews will be thrown out of the feast. All right. Then Jesus said to the centurion, verse 13, go, let it be done just as you believed it would. So Jesus knew that this centurion had great faith. The centurion had great faith. He believed that Jesus could do this. And just by speaking it, just by saying, be healed, your servant be healed, the centurion came to Jesus knowing. But he knew that all he had to do was come and ask, Lord, right? I am jealous of the faith that this centurion has. This man that the Jews refer to as a Gentile, a dog, a Roman citizen, whatever, I'm jealous of his faith. I yearn for the same faith. I pray every night, Lord, give me that faith. But this is just the one example that Jesus is using, and he's starting off so good here. The Sermon on the Mount, doing all this great stuff, giving all this new, revelation. And he's coming down and using this Gentile dog, Roman centurion, to show his faith. All right? To show us. This is a showing. Jesus, like I said before, he was amazed at the faith this man had. And he used this to show us. He cares about us this much. That he's using these miraculous things to show us. And it's in his word. All right? And it says, and his servant was healed that very hour. That's big. That's big stuff. I hope that throughout this week, I'm going to try to think about this, to ponder this, what is happening here in the beginning of chapter 8. I hope we all do, just to think about the faith that God gave this Roman, and we see it put into action, and we see, what crazy stuff is happening here. All right, that's it. That's all I've got. So our prayer should be that we have faith that this Roman centurion does. This man that should have kind of been exactly the opposite of what he was. Roman centurion, they're not given their position.
Yeah, because Caesar's position was off.
No, it's not off. But yeah, these guys aren't given their position based on their faith in Jesus. They're given their position based on something else. And it's the opposite of what this man was. So what does that say? What's that say about God's sovereignty and what God can do and the people he can use? And it rings true in the whole of Scripture. God always uses the least likely candidate. Right?
Yeah,
do you believe that?
One of Kim Jong-il's soldiers saying, "Oh Lord," like
sure, exactly.
Kim Jong said, "Nobody will powerful to him. You better not be bowing to nobody."
Yeah, exactly. All right, I'm gonna call it a done deal here.